If you want to save yourself thousands of pounds, set out your foundations for your house extension projects yourself, and I'll show you how you can do just that. So a big saving you can make in your home improvement projects is to tackle foundations yourself. And while there's a little bit to learn, which I'm going to show you here, the work itself is pretty straightforward and we don't need any fancy tools really, and where anyone with a bit of determination and organisation can do a fantastic job regardless of experience. With groundworks, you see, it's more about the preparation than experiential skill that's the key. By creating the option to do this yourself, you avoid the need to track down those hard to find builders in extremely short supply throughout the country at the moment. And in order to get your builds underway, and at the same time you will save yourself a serious amount of cash to spend elsewhere on your project. I'm going to show you how, probably in a couple of videos actually, some simple but really effective hacks and tips to keep everything plumb, level and preclude the need for any really expensive tools and lasers. Some old school methods that work like a charm even for absolute beginners, and if you stick to the end of the video I'll give you a really valuable tip that will help you get your foundations absolutely perfect in advance of getting the masonry down on top. So my name's Jeremy, and after qualifying as an architect I've built my career around buying, developing and extending apartments, houses and flats for buy-to-lets, for long-term rentals, for property flips and for platforms like Airbnb, and I've always managed the builds myself, doing most if not all of the builders' work and learning and saving a ton along the way. And I'm here to share all that learning with you to help you with your own projects. So with all that said, let's jump in. First we need to know what type of foundations do I need, and let's use this typical house extension as an example. Here's the type of drawings required. The design could be created by the architect, or you perhaps, if you've been following my videos, you've drawn it yourself. Check out the link for how I draw my projects to build here. And you'll need a structural engineer to create the final drawings, which will be specific to the soil and landscape conditions of your particular location. Although your local building control department will insist on an engineer's input, I would never take these engineers' drawings as absolutely gospel, unfortunately, and I'd wait instead until I've dug some trial holes at the start of the job before ordering any materials and any higher stuff. For example, here the engineer suggested a depth of 600 millimeters for the bottom of the foundation, but we actually had to dig down an additional 500 millimeters to 1.1 meters in total, and if I hadn't known that in advance we would have involved a hell of a lot more time, more stress and more cost. But knowing that, we knew how long the job was going to take, and instead of the trench taking a few days, I knew it would take at least twice as long, and we'd probably need to shore the trenches at that depth. That is really why you always need to add a contingency to your builds, and especially for groundworks. And I usually add at least 15, but usually 20% to whatever I think the cost of the foundation work will cost, simply because for that particular phase there's just so much that can pop up that no one could predict. Drains in the ground, tree roots, electric cables, hidden gold, there's always something, and you need to know you can still afford it when things go wrong. If it can go wrong with foundation work, it usually will go wrong. If you live in a typical house, it is very likely that the soil is perfect for strip and pad foundations, since that is what most houses are built, at least in the UK, and we shall focus on that therefore. So now we're ready to set out. We need a very few basic tools and materials, because I told you that after all you'll save thousands, right? So I'd get some 95 by 45 graded timber, probably treated, for any framing I'll need. For example, if I want to shore up the trenches. I will get about 4 or 5 sheets of 12mm OSB for the same reason. And I'll also use some of this for any protection whilst I'm pouring or mixing the concrete. I'll get some tarpaulins for some protection should it rain a lot during the works. I'll get a roll of heavy gauge polythene, which I can use for all sorts of protection stuff, such as like protecting a path. I will need some setting out string. We will need some softwood pegs, so we'll get these 25 by 38 millimeter treated timber battens for our setting out stakes. They again come in 4.8 meter lengths. We need some bright aerosol paint, a good tape measure, a decent handsaw, some 80 millimeter or 100 millimeter self-tapping wood screws, and a decent cordless driver tool. I like this DeWalt one because even with these tiny batteries you still get great torque and battery life, and it is very light to carry about. Now we'll probably want to put some masonry screws or bolts in a wall somewhere, so a drill with a masonry bit as well. We need a big and a small shovel. We need some wide timber battens to help us with things like ramps and such, so I'll get some 195 by 45 lengths of timber, maybe 2 or 3 at 4.8 meter lengths. Mesh is specified by your engineer and usually looks something like this with the A number. For the mesh reinforcement, it's usually a case of taking the area and cutting the mesh sheet to size inside the trench. Typical mesh size is delivered off the lorry to your house, too big to take in a van even, and is usually in the region of about 3.5 meter by 2 meters, and it is sometimes called rebar. So here we're digging down at the base of the existing house as our trial pits, and that would be the first thing to do before we do anything else. And because this house has existing foundations, we'll dig down and see what we find, trying to find the existing concrete level and pour the new strip foundations to the same depth level. Trial pits is a manual task to do with some hand tools, and it requires good old-fashioned elbow grease. You don't want to be going near it with a mini digger unless you've got a lot of experience. So get a shovel and a good breakfast. I've graduated from cereal to avocado, berries and chestnuts with loads of banana, and it's made a huge difference. And talking of making a huge difference, if you're enjoying the conversation, hitting the like button would really help me with developing the channel. So once I've uncovered the edge of the old foundations, I'll drill in some resin anchored bolts with my masonry drill into the side of the existing strip, which will make the new concrete bind into the old foundations, making the whole thing act as one, which is what you're always trying to do in order to restrict any differential movement between the old and the new parts. You're always going to get some shrinkage of the superstructure, but the foundations, you really don't want them to move at all from the existing. The final things to do before starting the dig are to ensure you've had a look at the weather, because rains can seriously weaken the soil at the edges, and you should always try to avoid working in muddy conditions, as a slippery site at this stage can be extremely dangerous. So look for a semi-dry period in the calendar and then reserve the equipment you'll want to hire, and which we'll talk more about in a minute. So now we've got our depth, we can start setting out, and for that we'll use a string line, some wooden pegs, the 25 by 38 battens as pegs and stakes, and some old-fashioned geometry. In fact, that geometry is as simple as a 3-4-5 triangle, whether you do it in meters or feet, as long as you keep the diagonal to 5 and the two sides parallel to the house at 3 and 4, you'll always end up with a perfect right angle. There's no magic art to it, just use an 8 or 1.8 meter spirit level to ensure the string is level, keep it taut, and then use a tape measure or setting out triangle if you have one. If I've got a sheet of rigid insulation kicking about on site, I'll definitely use that, since it's a perfect right angle template and it's nice and long, so it gets it even more accurate. Now, because this building is built from facing brick as opposed to, say, common brick with render over the top, the brick coursing is really essential to consider, so as you can ensure the new extension brickwork courses align with the existing house courses. And aside from it looking terrible, you sometimes want to tie the courses in at intervals, and you cannot do that if they don't align. So with your string line in place, get our tube of brightly coloured spray and carefully spray it down directly above the string to get your mark on the floor. And I'll always mark it to the outermost edge of where the foundation is going to be. And after triple checking all my measurements and ensuring everything is right angled and plumb, with our setting out complete, it is time to start digging. And now, unless you have a very small area of trenching or very shallow trenches, you're going to certainly need to hire a mini digger for either a couple of weekends if it's been done in your spare time, or for a week if you're doing it constantly. And you'll also need to remember to measure the access at the side of the house in order to physically get the thing into the back garden. I thought we were going to have to remove these steps, but I opted for the super mini version and we just managed to squeeze it through the gap. So that was a bit lucky. And you'll also need what is called a bucket, which is the bit that goes on the end of the hydraulic arm, and make sure you get the one which corresponds with your width of foundation. And in our case, it was the 600mm wide bucket. These mini diggers are fairly easy to operate, but it is a tedious and slow job nonetheless. And I think I paid about £280 for this one for just under a week, including the delivery, and that just about got us the job done. Now your job will be made far easier by hiring a mini dumper or skip loader, same thing, for about £150 to £200 a week. Unfortunately, we just couldn't get hold of one of those anywhere, so we had to borrow the soil from the skip with the ramps using our 195mm timber planks. Another repetitive task that just needs to get done in order to save you all this money. Like most of these tasks, it's not about the skill, it's about the preparation. So don't get rid of too much soil though, because you will be amazed at how much comes out, but similarly amazed about how much needs to go back in once the trench blocks are in and your walls are starting to take shape. Finally, when you put this material in a skip, remember the maximum size of skip that a lorry will take for this type of inert material is an 8-yard skip due to the weight rather than the bigger 14-yard. The skips I used came in at a cost of £280 per skip, and I think we used 2 for this, but I would allow for 4 because it's quite an imprecise amount when you're budgeting. Using the mini digger and the 600mm bucket, following the aerosol lines of the setting out, we'll dig down to the level we established earlier with our trial pits, and if I don't have a laser, I'll just use a long batten, cut to the depth of the trench with a spirit level to ensure the base of it is a consistent level and it's roughly plumb. If I'm ever in doubt about the trench, I'll always go a little deeper, and it is a slow process. This took 3 or 4 days in total. The key bit is to get it right and take your time. With the trench complete and with a relatively even bottom level, it's time to make preparations to ensure we can get the top face of the concrete poured absolutely level, and even a 10mm deviation along its length will make laying the trench blocks a total nightmare. I can't tell you the amount of times I've seen some poor bricklayer cutting slithers of a course of bricks or blocks because the foundation surface isn't level. So how do we get the top of this foundation totally level? Now you can buy a laser and staff to help you with this, but aside from the expense of having yet another bit of kit to buy, it's tricky to get right, and we're doing this as non-experts to save us money. So how would I do this? Well, there's an easier old school way, as I said at the start, and a valuable and easy tip I've always followed, which involves staking some pegs into the foot of the trench. You can use bits of rebar, but I'll just use these bits of timber batten, and I'll set them at 1.5 meter intervals into the ground, and I'll go around with my 1.8 meter level to get the tops of them level with where I want the top surface of my strip foundation to end up. I'll use the floor level of the existing house or an obvious brick course if one exists as the starting point for the setting out. Remember to alternate the orientation of your level as you go around the pegs to allow for any deviations in the calibration of the bead. Next, we need to cut the mesh sheets to the width of the trench and place them so they're suspended off the floor with spacers, or chairs as they're known, as the concrete needs to cover the mesh entirely by at least 35 millimeters. I'll just use bits of the rebar to space it off the ground. With my pegs all dead level, my mesh secure in the trench, and any shoring in place, I'm ready for the pour. So if you're pouring during the summer months, and that really is the best time for anyone without a lot of experience in pouring concrete, it's a case of looking forward a few weeks to see if and when there might be heavy periods of rain. You want to be avoiding pouring any kind of concrete in heavy and even moderate rain because of the propensity of the water to affect the mix of the concrete during the curing process. However, if you can get concrete poured before expected rain, covering it up immediately with the tarps or tarpaulins is the thing to do. If you're pouring in the winter, temperature as well as rain is a factor, and it's an absolute disaster to have freezing conditions with curing concrete. It might be an acceptable 7 or 8 degrees during the day, but during the evening, when you may have completed a pour, temperatures can drop to well below zero, at least where I live, during even the spring months. Weather on concrete is a topic in itself, but temperature and rain are the key points to consider. My advice would be, if you're not experienced in this, do the job in the spring, summer or autumn months, and always keep an eye on the night temperatures. So that covers it for the preparation for your foundations, and in the next video we'll talk about actually pouring concrete. I'll show you a top tip and another old school homemade super tool to work alongside your old school leveling pegs to ensure a super level foundation. I'll also link to how to quantify the amount of concrete for you and the options available for the next big decision you have to make, whether you use ready mix or you mix it by hand. And that is a topic in its own right, so I've made a separate video on that, which you can see here, where I cover how to order and how to choose the correct method to save you the most time and money. Subscribe if you want to keep up with what new videos I have coming up, and let me know any questions in the comments below. Thanks a lot for sticking to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.